Reality television promises honesty. Cameras follow private lives so closely that viewers believe nothing important is left unseen. But for some reality stars, the moments that truly mattered happened far from production crews. While audiences watched conflict edited for entertainment, real decisions were being made in silence, decisions that would later surface in courtrooms and prison records. This countdown examines 15 reality TV figures whose fame did not end in redemption or reinvention. Their paths shifted toward legal collapse, shaped by ignored warnings, repeated patterns, and the belief that attention could delay accountability. These stories reveal how quickly a public image can dissolve once the spotlight fades. So ask yourself, how does someone go from living for the camera to living under constant surveillance behind bars? And before we begin, tell us, which reality TV star do you think was hiding the most from viewers? Share your thoughts in the comments. 15. Amber Portwood. Amber Portwood became one of the earliest and most recognizable faces of modern reality television through a series that promised raw honesty about young motherhood relationships and life under constant scrutiny. From the beginning, her on-screen presence stood out for its emotional intensity. Viewers watched her swing between vulnerability and explosive anger, moments of remorse followed by moments of loss of control. The show framed her struggles as part of growing up too fast, in front of an audience, turning instability into a central storyline rather than a warning sign. As Amber's fame grew, the boundaries between personal crisis and public performance blurred. Arguments were filmed, breakdowns were broadcast, and private moments became entertainment. While audiences debated her behavior online, the underlying issues, untreated mental health struggles, difficulty regulating emotion, and escalating conflict, continued to deepen away from the camera. Reality television documented the symptoms, but it did not resolve the causes. According to verified court records, Amber's legal troubles emerged from a pattern of domestic incidents marked by escalating confrontations and threats of violence. Law enforcement reports described situations that moved quickly from verbal disputes into dangerous territory requiring police intervention. Prosecutors later emphasized repeated violations of probation terms and court orders, arguing that these were not isolated emotional lapses, but part of an ongoing inability to maintain control under stress. Court proceedings became a recurring chapter in Amber's life. Judges attempted to balance compassion with accountability, acknowledging documented mental health challenges while stressing the responsibility to comply with legal conditions designed to prevent further harm. Defense arguments highlighted years of psychological struggle and the pressure of growing up under constant public exposure. The court, however, focused on actions rather than intentions, noting repeated non-compliance, despite multiple opportunities for treatment and supervision. Periods of confinement marked a stark contrast to the openness of reality television. Without cameras, confessionals, or audience sympathy, Amber faced structure, restriction, and consequence. In later statements, she reflected on the difficulty of separating illness from responsibility, describing incarceration as a moment when performance ended and reality could no longer be avoided. Amber Portwood's story sets the tone for this countdown. It illustrates how reality fame can expose vulnerability without providing protection, and how unresolved personal struggles, when amplified by non-stop visibility, can spiral into legal collapse. Her downfall was not sudden. It unfolded slowly in plain sight, long before the court records made it official. 14. Ryan Edwards. Ryan Edwards became a familiar presence through a reality series that followed young parents struggling to transition into adulthood under relentless public attention. On screen, Ryan was often portrayed as distant, detached, and emotionally withdrawn. Viewers watched him avoid confrontation, disengage from responsibility, and drift through major life moments with visible apathy. The narrative framed his behavior as immaturity or resistance to growing up. What the show only hinted at was how deeply addiction was already shaping his choices behind the scenes. As Ryan's visibility increased, so did concern about his condition. Moments of slurred speech, impaired focus, and erratic behavior appeared on camera, sparking debate among viewers. While production continued, his personal life was quietly unraveling. Substance abuse escalated, affecting relationships, employment, and his ability to comply with basic obligations. Reality television captured fragments of dysfunction, but it never fully confronted the severity of what was unfolding in real time. According to verified court records, Ryan's legal troubles were directly tied to repeated substance-related offenses and ongoing violations of probation conditions. Law enforcement reports documented arrests involving drug possession, failed sobriety tests, and refusal to comply with court-ordered treatment programs. These incidents formed a consistent pattern rather than isolated mistakes, revealing an inability to maintain stability despite repeated intervention. As cases accumulated, judges emphasized accountability alongside rehabilitation. Court filings revealed a cycle-mandated treatment followed by relapse, then renewed legal consequences. Defense arguments highlighted addiction as a chronic illness requiring long-term care, while prosecutors focused on repeated non-compliance and public safety concerns. Each appearance in court reinforced the conclusion that opportunities for correction had been exhausted. Periods of incarceration marked a shift in Ryan's public narrative. The reality TV portrayal of emotional detachment was replaced by official records detailing arrests, violations, and supervision. Fame offered visibility, but no protection. Once legal thresholds were crossed, the consequences arrived without regard for public sympathy or storyline context. Ryan Edwards' story demonstrates how addiction can quietly erode stability while appearing on screen as mere dysfunction. When substance abuse goes unaddressed, reality fame often accelerates the collapse rather than preventing it. 13. Ronnie Ortiz Magro. Ronnie Ortiz Magro became one of the most volatile figures in party-driven reality television, a franchise built on excess confrontation and constant emotional escalation. On screen, Ronnie's relationships were defined by intensity, dramatic reconciliations, followed by explosive arguments that played out repeatedly in front of cameras. Viewers watched cycles of jealousy, anger, and regret, framed as entertainment, often mistaking instability for passion. What the show did not fully confront was how these patterns continued when production stopped. As Ronnie's fame grew, the boundary between performance and real life collapsed. Conflicts that once seemed exaggerated for television began spilling into private spaces with serious consequences. The emotional volatility audiences had normalized became a defining pattern rather than a storyline. Reality television amplified his behavior, but it did not contain it. According to verified court records, Ronnie's legal troubles stemmed from multiple domestic incidents that escalated into law enforcement intervention. Police reports documented confrontations involving physical aggression, property damage, and violations of protective orders. Prosecutors later outlined a repeated pattern of behavior in which conflicts intensified rather than de-escalated, even after prior arrests and court-imposed conditions designed to prevent further harm. As cases progressed through the courts, judges emphasized compliance, anger management, and accountability. Court filings showed repeated violations that suggested an inability to control behavior under emotional stress. Defense arguments pointed to substance abuse and mental health struggles, emphasizing treatment efforts and periods of apparent stability. The court, however, focused on documented actions and the cumulative risk created by repetition. Legal consequences reshaped Ronnie's public trajectory. What began as chaotic romance presented for ratings evolved into a public record defined by arrests, supervision, and court oversight. The reality TV environment that once rewarded conflict could no longer shield him once harm extended beyond the screen. Ronnie Ortiz Magro's story illustrates how volatility, when normalized and amplified, can evolve into legal crisis. Reality television captured the drama, but the justice system addressed the danger. 12. Janice Dickinson. Janice Dickinson entered reality television with a reputation already forged decades earlier. Long before cameras followed her daily life, she was known as a dominant, confrontational presence in the fashion world, outspoken, unapologetic, and fiercely self-directed. Reality TV amplified those traits, reframing them as sharp honesty and authority. Viewers saw explosive arguments, cutting remarks, and a persona built on fearlessness. What the shows rarely examined was how years of pressure, addiction, and instability continued to shape her life far beyond the spectacle. As Janice transitioned into reality programming, the line between personality and survival blurred. The confrontational style that once secured relevance also masked long-standing struggles with substance abuse and emotional regulation. While the camera rewarded volatility with airtime, it did little to address the underlying patterns that followed her offset. Public attention returned, but stability did not. According to verified court records and public filings, Janice's legal troubles were tied to substance-related incidents and repeated failures to comply with legal conditions during periods of decline. Law enforcement reports documented encounters involving impaired behavior and violations that reflected persistent issues rather than isolated lapses. These problems resurfaced across different phases of fame, often during moments when structure weakened and accountability faded. As matters moved through the courts, judges emphasized compliance and treatment over celebrity status. Filings revealed cycles of recovery attempts, followed by relapse, reinforcing concerns about sustainability without consistent oversight. Defense arguments pointed to addiction as a chronic condition, shaped by decades of exposure to high-pressure environments. The court, however, focused on documented behavior and repeated non-compliance when determining consequences. Periods of confinement marked a stark contrast to the authority Janice projected on screen. The loss of control and autonomy forced a confrontation with consequences that reputation could not offset. In later reflections, she acknowledged destructive patterns and the cost of avoiding sustained change, describing legal consequences as unavoidable outcomes of years spent postponing accountability. Janice Dickinson's story illustrates how reality television can revive notoriety without repairing what fame helped fracture. Visibility may return again and again, but without stability, the cycle simply resets. 11. Chumley Russell. Chumley Russell became one of reality television's most recognizable figures through a series built on collectibles negotiation and everyday expertise. On screen, he was framed as approachable and humorous, the relaxed counterweight to a more serious environment. His familiarity with viewers turned into trust, and trust quickly turned into fame. As his popularity grew, appearances, merchandise, and public attention followed, creating a life far larger than the shop floor where audiences first met him. What few considered was how sudden visibility can magnify private choices that were never meant to be examined. Away from the cameras, Chumley's life expanded rapidly, bringing new freedoms and fewer boundaries. The persona that felt harmless on television did not come with a roadmap for managing pressure, access, or scrutiny. While the show continued to portray routine transactions and light-hearted moments, off-camera decisions accumulated without narrative framing or protection. According to verified court records, Chumley's legal troubles began when law enforcement executed a search warrant connected to an investigation unrelated to his television work. During the search, officers recovered illegal items that led to charges involving controlled substances and weapons possession. The case immediately altered public perception, transforming a comedic reality figure into a criminal defendant facing serious legal consequences. As the matter moved through the courts, filings showed the charges stemmed from private conduct rather than on-screen behavior. Defense arguments emphasized cooperation, lack of violent intent, and steps taken toward compliance once charges were filed. Prosecutors stressed that possession violations carried inherent risk regardless of intent or public image. The court weighed these factors, resolving the case through negotiated outcomes that avoided prolonged trial while still underscoring accountability. The legal episode marked a permanent shift in how Chumley was viewed. The contrast between a friendly television persona and the reality of arrest highlighted how quickly fame can invert perception. While the case did not erase his career, it dismantled the assumption that approachability equaled immunity. Chumley Russell's story illustrates how visibility can turn private mistakes into defining moments. In the world of reality television, familiarity does not reduce responsibility. It amplifies the consequences when boundaries are crossed. 10. Tila Tequila. Tila Tequila rose to prominence during the early wave of reality television, a period when shock value and personality could turn someone into a household name almost overnight. Her on-screen image was built on provocation, unpredictability, and a willingness to push boundaries without apology. Viewers watched her embrace controversy as a form of control, using confrontation, points, and spectacle to dominate attention in a crowded media landscape. What appeared as fearless self-expression was in reality the surface of a much deeper instability developing off-camera. As her fame expanded, attention became both currency and pressure. The persona that once generated relevance demanded constant escalation to stay visible. While television rewarded extreme behavior with airtime, it offered no structure for managing the personal consequences that followed. Relationships fractured, judgment deteriorated, and the line between performance and real-life behavior became increasingly blurred. The camera amplified symptoms, not solutions. According to verified court records and law enforcement reports, Tila's legal troubles emerged during periods marked by substance abuse, erratic conduct, and repeated conflicts with authorities. Arrests and violations were tied to impaired judgment, and failures to comply with legal conditions imposed to curb further harm. These incidents were not isolated missteps, but part of a recurring pattern that unfolded as her public relevance declined and instability intensified. As matters moved through the courts, judges emphasized compliance, supervision, and treatment over spectacle. Filings showed cycles of intervention, followed by relapse, underscoring how difficult sustained stability became once attention faded. Defense arguments pointed to mental health struggles and the psychological toll of sudden fame. The court, however, relied on documented behavior and repeated non-compliance when determining consequences. Legal supervision and brief confinement marked a stark contrast to the hyper-visible lifestyle that once defined her career. Without an audience, validation disappeared, leaving only accountability. In later reflections, she acknowledged how attention had become both a coping mechanism and a trigger accelerating collapse rather than preventing it. Tila Tequila's story illustrates how reality television can reward volatility until it becomes impossible to control. When controversy replaces identity, accountability often arrives quietly through court dates rather than cameras. Do you think Tila's downfall was driven more by the pressure to remain relevant or by personal struggles that fame only intensified? Share your thoughts in the comments. 9. Tiffany Cook. Tiffany Cook entered reality television as an unfiltered and confrontational presence, quickly becoming known for volatility that producers framed as entertainment. On screen, conflict followed her almost immediately. Arguments escalated, tempers flared, and moments of restraint were rare. Viewers often interpreted the chaos as exaggerated personality or competitive performance, a necessary ingredient for dramatic television. What the episodes did not reveal was how deeply ingrained those behaviors were, and how easily they transferred into real-world situations without cameras to soften the consequences. As her visibility increased, so did the intensity of her interactions off-screen. The confrontational style that earned attention on television became habitual, shaping how disputes were handled in everyday life. Reality TV normalized escalation, rewarding dominance and reaction rather than de-escalation. Over time, the difference between performance and personal conduct disappeared, leaving little separation between televised conflict and actual harm. According to verified court records, Tiffany's legal troubles stemmed from violent incidents tied to impaired judgment and uncontrolled aggression. Law enforcement reports documented confrontations that moved beyond arguments into serious physical injury, prompting arrests and formal charges. Prosecutors emphasized that these were not spontaneous outbursts, but episodes where control collapsed entirely, producing consequences far more severe than anything portrayed for entertainment. As the cases moved through the courts, judges focused on accountability and public safety. Filings reflected concerns about repeated behavior, substance use, and failure to disengage from conflict despite warnings. Defense arguments pointed to emotional instability and the influence of an environment that rewarded aggression. The court, however, relied on documented actions, injuries, and prior incidents when determining sentences and supervision. Periods of incarceration replaced the audience that once amplified her behavior. Without cameras or validation, consequences arrived directly and without framing. In later reflections, Tiffany acknowledged how quickly performative confrontation turned into irreversible damage once it left the controlled space of television. Tiffany Cook's story illustrates how reality television can normalize destructive behavior until it crosses a legal line. When volatility becomes identity, the transition from spectacle to criminal record can happen suddenly and permanently. 8. Richard Wyatt. Richard Wyatt became widely recognized through a reality series that followed the inner workings of a high-risk firearms business. On screen, he was presented as authoritative, disciplined, and highly knowledgeable, someone who operated confidently within a tightly regulated and dangerous industry. The show emphasized professionalism, expertise, and control, framing his access to weapons as responsibility rather than risk. Viewers saw a man who appeared to understand the rules better than anyone else. What the series did not explore was how far his off-camera decisions were drifting from the legal boundaries he was expected to uphold. As the show gained attention, Wyatt's public image became inseparable from expertise and authority. That perception created a sense of insulation, the idea that familiarity with regulations equaled protection from scrutiny. While cameras captured transactions and craftsmanship, investigators were quietly documenting a different reality, one in which access and confidence were being treated as substitutes for compliance. The gap between image and obligation continued to widen. According to verified federal court records, Richard's legal troubles centered on serious firearms violations involving the unlawful possession and modification of restricted weapons. Prosecutors detailed how certain firearms were handled and transferred in ways that violated federal law, with evidence showing awareness rather than accident. Investigators recovered weapons records and communications that demonstrated repeated decisions to ignore regulations designed to protect public safety. As proceedings unfolded, the court examined whether these actions were technical mistakes or deliberate choices. Defense arguments emphasized professional background and claimed confusion over regulatory complexity. Prosecutors countered that expertise increased responsibility, not leniency, and that repeated violations pointed to intent rather than misunderstanding. Judges highlighted the scale of the offenses and the potential danger created by non-compliance when delivering custodial consequences. Confinement marked a dramatic reversal. The authority once projected on television gave way to routine and restriction, stripping away any illusion that reputation could outweigh accountability. The case underscored how quickly public credibility collapses when private conduct contradicts professional standards. Richard Wyatt's story illustrates how confidence can harden into complacency. In environments built on power and access, the margin for error is narrow, and belief in one's own immunity often becomes the final mistake. 7. Matt Brown. Matt Brown became a recognizable figure through a survival-focused reality series that emphasized isolation, resilience, and family loyalty. On screen, Matt was often portrayed as thoughtful and introspective, someone who spoke openly about addiction, regret, and the desire to change. Viewers saw vulnerability framed as honesty, and many believed his struggles were being confronted head-on. What the episodes could not resolve was how fragile recovery remained once the structure of production disappeared. As the show's popularity grew, Matt's openness turned into a defining trait. Confessionals became moments of reflection, and discussions of sobriety were woven into his storyline. But reality television documented the struggle more than it supported the solution. Outside filming schedules, the pressure of visibility expectations from audiences, and long periods without supervision created conditions where relapse became more likely. The same isolation that made compelling television also removed safeguards essential for long-term stability. According to verified court records, Matt's legal troubles were tied to substance abuse and repeated encounters with law enforcement. Police reports documented incidents involving intoxication, disorderly conduct, and violations that resurfaced during periods of relapse. These were not sudden changes in character, but returns to long-standing patterns that re-emerged whenever support weakened. Each encounter reinforced how difficult sustained recovery can be without consistent structure. As cases moved through the courts, judges emphasized treatment alongside accountability. Court filings reflected cycles of rehabilitation followed by renewed violations, raising concerns about the effectiveness of short-term interventions. Defense arguments highlighted addiction as a chronic condition requiring long-term care and supervision. The court, however, focused on documented behavior and public safety, noting that repeated chances had not produced lasting change. Periods of confinement interrupted the narrative of recovery presented on television. Without cameras or an audience, Matt faced consequences without framing or sympathy. In later reflections, he acknowledged that progress required more than public honesty. It required sustained discipline away from the spotlight. The transition underscored the difference between talking about change and maintaining it when no one is watching. Matt Brown's story illustrates how reality television can expose personal struggle without guaranteeing resolution. When recovery becomes part of a storyline rather than a long-term process, relapse can still carry serious consequences. 6. Latarian Milton. Latarian Milton became a public figure almost overnight after a brief television appearance turned him into a viral symbol of defiance and shock. What began as a single moment, a child speaking back with startling confidence, was replayed endlessly across media platforms. The attention transformed a private family incident into a national talking point, freezing Latarian's identity at a moment he never chose to represent his future. What viewers did not see was how that sudden notoriety followed him long after the cameras stopped. As the attention faded, the label remained. The viral moment became a reference point he could not escape shaping how authority figures, peers, and the public perceived him while he was still growing up. Instead of support and structure, notoriety brought expectations and assumptions. The spotlight moved on, but the consequences of early exposure did not. Without guidance tailored to the pressures he faced, instability quietly deepened. According to verified court records, Letarian's later legal troubles reflected a pattern of escalating offenses as he entered adulthood. Law enforcement reports documented arrests tied to theft, property crimes, and repeated violations that suggested difficulty disengaging from risky behavior. Prosecutors described a trajectory where early intervention opportunities failed to redirect behavior, allowing instability to solidify into habit rather than resolve with maturity. As cases progressed, judges weighed rehabilitation against accountability. Court filings referenced prior encounters with the justice system that had not produced lasting change, emphasizing the need for consequences that addressed public safety. Defense arguments pointed to youth lack of consistent guidance and the long shadow of public labeling that began before adulthood. The court, however, focused on documented actions and the repetition of offenses when determining sentences. Periods of confinement marked a stark contrast to the brief fame that once defined him. Without an audience or attention, consequences became immediate and personal. The viral moment that introduced Letarian to the world offered no roadmap for adulthood, leaving him to navigate notoriety without structure or protection. Letarian Milton's story illustrates how early exposure can distort development when notoriety replaces opportunity. Fame without support can freeze a person in a moment they never outgrew, even as real life demands responsibility. 5. Antoine Dodson. Antoine Dodson became famous in an instant after a spontaneous television interview turned a local crime story into a global internet phenomenon. His sharp delivery and memorable phrasing propelled him into viral stardom, transforming an ordinary moment into a cultural catchphrase repeated across news outlets, music charts, and social media. For a brief period, Antoine's life was reshaped by attention opportunities and a level of recognition he never sought and never prepared for. As the spotlight intensified, success arrived quickly. Appearances, endorsements, and public interest followed. But viral fame is often unstable, offering visibility without longevity or guidance. Once the attention faded, the infrastructure that supports sustained success was largely absent. Financial pressure replaced momentum, and expectations created during the peak of visibility became difficult to meet when opportunities slowed. Reality television and viral culture amplified the moment, but they offered no blueprint for what came after. According to verified court records, Antoine's later legal troubles were tied to financial disputes and unpaid obligations that escalated into criminal matters. Law enforcement reports documented conflicts involving failure to meet court-ordered requirements, resulting in arrest and confinement. Prosecutors emphasized that the case was not about the moment that made him famous, but about decisions made long after the cameras had moved on. As proceedings unfolded, the court focused on accountability rather than notoriety. Defense arguments pointed to sudden fame, lack of financial literacy, and the absence of long-term support following viral success. Judges acknowledged the unusual circumstances surrounding his rise, but relied on documented conduct and repeated non-compliance when determining consequences. Periods of incarceration marked a sharp contrast to the noise of Antoine's viral peak. Without an audience or validation, consequences unfolded quietly in courtrooms rather than headlines. In later reflections, Antoine spoke about how quickly fame disappeared and how unprepared he was for life after the internet moved on. Antoine Dodson's story highlights a different kind of downfall, one driven not by excess celebrity, but by how abruptly attention can vanish. When fame arrives without structure or sustainability, the collapse can be just as destabilizing as sudden success. 4. Angela Stanton. Angela Stanton entered the reality television landscape under unusual circumstances. Unlike many cast members who rose to fame through long-running storylines, her presence was tied to association controversy and unresolved history rather than celebrity ambition. On screen, she appeared on the margins of a franchise built around wealth power and tightly controlled narratives. Viewers sensed tension, but the show offered little context, leaving much of her background unexplained. What was largely absent from the televised portrayal was the fact that her most consequential experiences had already taken place long before the cameras arrived. Years prior to her reality television appearance, Angela's life had intersected directly with the criminal justice system. According to verified court records, her legal troubles stemmed from participation in a multi-person criminal conspiracy involving vehicle theft and related financial crimes. Prosecutors described a coordinated operation that relied on planning false documentation and deliberate execution rather than impulsive behavior. The case resulted in conviction and a custodial sentence establishing a criminal record that defined a major chapter of her life well before any reality show involvement. When Angela later appeared in a reality TV context, that history became a point of contention rather than transparency. The program referenced conflict without fully explaining its origins, creating a fragmented narrative that confused viewers and fueled speculation. Legal accountability had already occurred, but reality television reframed her presence as drama instead of consequence. The difference between lived reality and edited storytelling became impossible to ignore. Periods of incarceration marked a turning point that television exposure could not erase. The experience removed ambiguity, replacing speculation with documented outcomes and personal reckoning. After release, Angela publicly acknowledged her past, while also criticizing how selectively it was presented within entertainment formats. She argued that omission distorted understanding, turning accountability into rumor and consequence into storyline. Angela Stanton's story illustrates how reality television can compress serious legal histories into incomplete narratives. When exposure comes after accountability, the result is often misunderstanding rather than clarity. Her case highlights the limits of entertainment when it intersects with real-world consequences that cannot be edited away. 3. Larissa dos Santos Lima. Larissa dos Santos Lima became one of the most talked-about figures in relationship-based reality television, known for her blunt communication style, emotional volatility, and constant on-screen conflict. Viewers watched arguments escalate rapidly, often framed as cultural misunderstanding or fiery personality. The show turned confrontation into narrative fuel placing. Larissa at the center of repeated clashes that blurred the line between entertainment and instability. What audiences did not see was how those conflicts continued off-camera, where consequences were no longer controlled by editing. As Larissa's visibility increased, pressure followed. Living in a new country, navigating immigration stress, and maintaining a public relationship intensified emotional strain. Reality television amplified every disagreement, rewarding escalation with airtime. Over time, confrontation became expectation rather than exception, shaping how disputes were handled both publicly and privately. According to verified court records, Larissa's legal troubles stemmed from multiple domestic incidents that required law enforcement intervention. Police reports documented repeated calls involving heated confrontations that crossed legal boundaries, leading to arrests and court supervision. Prosecutors emphasized that these were not isolated misunderstandings, but recurring incidents that demonstrated an inability to de-escalate conflict once it began. As the cases moved through the courts, judges focused on compliance counseling and accountability. Legal filings reflected concern over repeated behavior despite warnings and imposed conditions. Defense arguments pointed to cultural adjustment, emotional stress, and the pressure of constant public exposure. The court, however, relied on documented actions rather than context when determining consequences. Periods of detention and legal supervision altered Larissa's public narrative. The reality TV image of dramatic personality was replaced by a record defined by restraint and legal boundaries. While she continued to maintain a public presence afterward, the arrests permanently reshaped how her behavior was interpreted by audiences. Larissa dos Santos Lima's story illustrates how reality television can amplify conflict without resolving it. When volatility becomes a storyline, the transition from televised drama to legal consequence can be swift. 2. Jeffrey Pascal. Jeffrey Pascal entered reality television, presenting himself as confident romantic and emotionally open. On screen, he was framed as a composed figure, seeking connection, carefully controlling how his past was discussed. Viewers were shown a narrative of vulnerability and redemption, with little indication that serious legal issues were already looming beyond the show's boundaries. The gap between public portrayal and private reality was wide, and it would soon collapse. According to verified court records, Jeffrey's legal troubles centered on violent offenses stemming from a domestic incident that predated his rise in reality television. Prosecutors presented medical documentation, photographs of injuries, and witness testimony that established the severity of the assault. The case revealed a pattern of behavior inconsistent with the image presented on television, raising questions about what had been omitted from the narrative audiences received. As the trial unfolded, the court examined extensive evidence detailing the impact of the violence and the credibility of the accounts presented. Defense arguments attempted to reframe the incident and challenge testimony, but prosecutors countered with corroborated records and timelines. The judge emphasized the seriousness of the offense and the lasting harm caused when delivering a substantial custodial sentence. The verdict abruptly ended Jeffrey's reality television trajectory. Any possibility of public redemption through entertainment was replaced by legal accountability. The controlled storyline he had presented to viewers dissolved under the weight of courtroom facts, exposing the risks of selective storytelling when serious allegations remain off camera. Jeffrey Pascal's story highlights how reality television can obscure critical truths. When entertainment prioritizes narrative over disclosure, the reckoning arrives later and far more forcefully. Do you think reality shows have a responsibility to disclose serious allegations about participants? Or should that line remain outside entertainment? Share your thoughts in the comments. 1. Todd Herzog. Todd Herzog rose to prominence as a strategic and disciplined competitor on a survival-based reality series, earning admiration for resilience, focus, and mental endurance. On screen, he appeared controlled and capable under extreme conditions, reinforcing the idea that success came from inner strength and balance. What viewers did not see was how life after victory introduced a different kind of struggle, one without structure, routine, or clear boundaries. After the spotlight faded, Todd faced escalating challenges tied to substance abuse. According to verified court records, his legal troubles emerged during periods marked by intoxication, disorderly conduct, and repeated encounters with law enforcement. The incidents reflected a rapid decline in stability once the regimented environment of competition disappeared. Fame amplified expectations, but did not provide support for the transition back to ordinary life. As cases moved through the courts, judges emphasized treatment alongside accountability. Filings showed attempts at rehabilitation followed by relapse, highlighting how difficult sustained recovery became without consistent structure. Defense arguments pointed to addiction as a medical condition, exacerbated by sudden fame and isolation. The court, however, focused on documented conduct and public safety when imposing custody and supervision. Confinement marked a stark reversal from the triumph that once defined Todd's public image. Victory and admiration were replaced by routine and restriction. In later reflections, Todd openly acknowledged the depth of his addiction and the role isolation played in his collapse, describing recovery as a long process rather than a single turning point. Todd Herzog's story closes this countdown with a reminder that winning does not guarantee protection from personal demons. Fame can magnify success, but it can also strip away the structure that keeps struggles in check. The stories in this countdown reveal a pattern reality television rarely confronts honestly. Fame does not erase addiction, instability, anger, or unresolved trauma. In many cases, it accelerates them. Cameras capture personalities, arguments, and moments designed for entertainment, but they rarely show the quiet decisions, repeated warnings, and private breakdowns that lead to arrests, convictions, and confinement. What makes these stories unsettling is how visible the warning signs were. Audiences watched conflicts escalate, behaviors repeat, and accountability delayed, often mistaking dysfunction for drama. When the spotlight faded, reality arrived without editing, without narrative protection, and without applause. Courtrooms replaced confessionals. Sentences replaced storylines. These were not sudden collapses. They were slow descents that unfolded alongside fame, not after it. Reality television documented the surface, but the consequences were written elsewhere in police reports, court filings, and prison records. Before you go, consider this. Which story in this countdown changed how you view reality television the most? And do you believe fame reveals who people truly are, or pushes them toward becoming someone they never expected to be? Leave your thoughts in the comments.